Good evening, everyone. So on behalf of the U.S. China Strategic Studies Organization and the Onero Institute, I would like to welcome you all to our first U.S. China Youth Exposition series with tonight's event specifically focused on U.S. China competition and collaboration in Africa. It's undeniable that over the past 2 decades, Chinese investment and interest in Africa has grown enormously. As a consequence, many in the West, especially here in the United States, have become increasingly concerned about the effect of this growing Chinese influence on the continent. From disputes over so-called debt trap diplomacy to concerns about coercive vaccine diplomacy, there are many sources of potential competition and conflict between China and the United States and Africa. At the same time, Africa is a continent home to some of the fastest growing economies in the world and is in desperate need of infrastructure and development to continue its ongoing industrialization. With this in mind, important questions remain about how China, Africa, and the United States should manage and handle this ongoing competition. Has China's role in Africa been a net positive for the continent? Has Africa gotten the best out of its relationship with the 2 superpowers? How much should the United States care about democracy promotion and market liberalization when attempting to counter Chinese influence? To discuss these questions and many more, we have perhaps the best candidate possible to have this conversation with, in the case of our very own Elliott School professor, David Shinn. Professor Shinn is the former U.S. Ambassador to Burkina Faso from 1987 to 1990. And later the ambassador to Ethiopia from 1996 to 1999. Professor Shinn is also an established writer and known authority on the role of China in Africa. He wrote the book, China and Africa, A Century of Engagement, that was published in 2012. And to moderate this discussion tonight, also someone from the Elliott School, Tsung-Han, who is a contributor at the U.S. China Strategic Studies Organization. Originally from Taiwan, his primary interest is great power competition between China and the United States. Before I give way to allow this conversation to begin, just a few formalities and notes for today's event. First, Professor Shinn is going to begin with opening remarks, and then followed by a moderated discussion with Taichung. Afterwards, we will be having a Q&A session. So during the event, please think of questions you would like to ask. For those of us participating online, of which there are 20, I'm seeing over here, feel free to put a question in the chat, and I will try to get to as many as possible, provided I'm sure people in the audience would also like to ask some questions as well. Finally, just a few administrative rules. According to school policy, people in the audience will have to keep their masks on. I would like to ask people online to please keep your camera off and make sure that you are muted during the duration of the event. Zoom attendees may submit their questions via chat and I will read them aloud. And please know we will be recording today's session. So if you'd like to share it with someone, that will be distributed later. Without further ado, please give a round of applause to today's speakers, Professor David Shinn and our moderator, Taichung.
So, Professor, do you want to deliver your opening remark to frame us the issue?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'll keep my remarks fairly brief, and I'm here as a specialist on China, Africa, and also U.S. Africa, not a specialist on U.S. China. That's not my area of expertise. I do try to follow China-U.S. relations as carefully as I can. But that's a whole different topic, and we have a lot of experts at GW that do that. I don't happen to be one of them. I want to begin by emphasizing that today all the emphasis is on competition. When you look at the engagement of China and the engagement of the US in Africa, everyone's talking competition. There's almost no discussion of cooperation. And I'm going to deal with both topics, probably a little more on the competition side because that's where all the action is today. But it is important to understand that there has been a history of some modest cooperation, and the world doesn't stay the same. Who knows what it's going to look like 10, 20 years from now in terms of the U.S. China relationship and how they interact in Africa. I want to start with making a few basic comparisons of China and the U.S. in Africa. China-Africa trade in 2021 was $254 billion. It was the largest, China was the largest trading partner of Africa and has been since 2009 when it passed the United States. This was actually a new high watermark for China-Africa trade. The previous high watermark was 2015, and then trade actually began slipping between China and Africa, but it had a major uptick in 2021 and then reached this new high. However, that only constitutes about 4% of China's global trade. So Africa is not a huge player when it comes to trade with China. It's pretty small potatoes. But more importantly, and what is almost never discussed, is that look at that $254 billion, and there's a huge trade surplus for China, which means you have a huge trade deficit for Africa. That's not a good situation for the African countries. Now, looking at the U.S. Africa trade, in 2021, it was only $64 billion, well below China-Africa trade, and only about 2% of global U.S. trade. So the Africa plays an even smaller role for the United States than it does for China. But on the other hand, Africa had a significant trade surplus with the United States of that $64 billion. And that's a good thing for Africa. If you look at foreign direct investment stock, for China in Africa today, it's about $49 billion in terms of total stock that has gone into the continent. For the US, the latest figure is $47.5 billion. That's about the same. China has edged slightly ahead, and it's true that in recent years, there has been more Chinese FDI going into Africa than US FDI going into the continent. Nevertheless, the stock is about equal today. If you look at aid, and I'm using an OECD definition of aid, which is a very precise definition, the United States has been sending about $9 billion annually in aid to Africa. This compares in recent years to about $2.5 billion in aid, OECD equivalent aid from China to Africa. So the United States is more than 3 times the aid giver to Africa that China is. This is also a fact that is rarely commented upon. China is Africa's major bilateral source of loans, very different than aid. There are some loans that have components that qualify as OECD equivalent aid, and I have included that in the $2.5 billion annual figure. But most of what China is doing in Africa in recent years has been in the form of loans, and by and large, loans at commercial rates. That does not qualify as aid. But it is true that China is the largest bilateral provider of loans to Africa in recent years. The United States provides almost no loans anymore. We got out of the loan business. The good side of that is that we're not to Africa's debt because we're not offering loans. Now, the U.S. does support loans coming from the World Bank, the African Development Bank, other multilateral institutions. It's not, for the most part, not bilateral loans. China is also in the process of reducing the quantity and the volume of its loans to Africa. This has been a relatively recent development. China provides about 2,000 personnel to UN peacekeeping operations in Africa. That's far more than the United States provides. The US provides only a handful to UN peacekeeping operations. On the other hand, the United States provides far more US bilateral security cooperation to Africa than China does. It's hard to measure it because it's a lot of training that goes on, a lot of it in Africa, some in the United States, and a number of literally engagements that US Special Forces, for example, are involved in. During the 21st, during the 21st century and up to the present time, China has had a much better record on arranging high-level exchange visits between Chinese personnel as compared to Americans providing exchange visits with American personnel. This continues to be the case, although COVID-19 has cut into that record, and there are certainly fewer high-level engagements going on today. If you look at the trend line throughout the 21st century, I think it's fair to say that it has been rising for China in Africa throughout the 21st century, or it is flatlined in some cases. But if you look at the United States trend line throughout the 21st century, it has actually been on the decline or it has remained flat. So the trend has been very much in the favor of China. Let me turn to the issue of competition. And you cannot separate the issue of the US response in Africa to what China is doing from the US-China relationship. They're obviously very closely integrated. And for those of us who specialize in Africa, sometimes it would be nice to separate these two things, but it just doesn't work that way. So as a result, you have to take into account how is the China-US relationship when you look at how things are being dealt with in Africa. US-China relations today are overwhelmingly negative. Most of you know the reasons for this, and it's not my task to review US-China relations tonight. Let me refer to, however, to comments that were made just last month by the head of the FBI, Christopher Wray, because they kind of summarize where the situation is today. He said there is no country that presents a broader threat to our ideas, innovation, and economic security than China. Wray added that the threat from China is not new, but it's reached a new level, more brazen and more damaging than ever before. And it's vital that we focus on this threat. So that's the official or statement from a high-level official in the sort of security sector of the US government. Now, he was referencing particularly the stealing of US information and technology. But there is a recent history, of course, of trade wars that were largely originated on the US side during the Trump administration, which continue to the present day. There also are very, very different views of human rights inside China by the United States and by China. And all of this enhances the prospects for competition carrying over into Africa. In fact, US-Africa policy during the Trump administration was largely based on competition with China and Russia. The Biden administration is taking a more nuanced approach and has maintained many of the competitive elements as it interacts with China and Africa. But it's not the same as it was in the Trump administration. Now, there will always be a competitive element to certain aspects of the US-China relationship in Africa. And there's almost no exception to this. There will be commercial competition to win contracts, exploit certain natural resources, sell goods, and win investment deals. Quite frankly, this is no different than US competition with France, India, Sweden, or the entire rest of the world. It's the same kind of commercial competition. There's a much greater US concern in the security arena as China seeks to become a global power. It has its first military base in Djibouti, which was something of a surprise to the United States when it opened in 2017. And then you've had this very recent discussion in the media about a possible Chinese military facility in Equatorial Guinea. Now, I have no idea whether China has any intention to establish a military facility in Equatorial Guinea or not. But there have been 2 American delegations that have gone to Equatorial Guinea to make the case to the Equatorial Guineans, basically don't allow China to establish a base here, which suggests to me that the United States must have intelligence suggesting that that is a very strong possibility. The point is that the current US-China relationship ensures that the focus in Africa, and the rest of the world for that matter, will be on competition and not cooperation, at least for the time being. But I do want to talk about cooperation and its possibility. There was a period not long ago when there was modest US-China cooperation in Africa. Both countries seek political stability, the defeat of terrorist groups, and economic development on the continent. We have pretty much the same general goals for Africa. There were limited collaborative efforts to achieve political stability in both Sudan and South Sudan. The US has historically welcomed Chinese participation in UN peacekeeping operations in Africa, because that contributes to political stability, at least theoretically. And there was even a collaborative UN peacekeeping project in Liberia. There was some cooperation in combating disease pandemics in Africa, for example, Ebola in West Africa, and cooperation at the Center for African Disease headquarters in Addis Ababa. The US and China worked together in combating Somali piracy in the Gulf of Aden. And in 2009, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense praised China's contribution to the anti-piracy effort, adding, quote, "The work they've done has been highly professional, it's been highly effective, and it's been well coordinated with the United States and with other navies that are working there." This was only 13 years ago. That sentiment is impossible today, but the world never stays the same. Who knows where the US will be, and more importantly, where China will be 13 years from now. Let me close with a quote from Joseph Nye that I just ran across a couple days ago that I thought sort of summarized the way I see the future rather well. Quote, "In the near term, given the rising nationalism and assertive policies of the Xi government, the United States will probably have to spend more time on the rivalry side of the equation. But if it avoids ideological demonization and misleading Cold War analogies and maintains its alliances, the US can succeed with a realistic, no regrets strategy." So let me leave it there, and hopefully I have generated enough controversy with the competition and cooperation side of the argument, but I will turn the program over to Henry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shinn. And there was obviously a lot to unpack there. We talk about trade, talk about debt, talk about investment, and some geopolitics and possible cooperation as well in the future. So the first thing that drew my attention is obviously the trade aspect of US and Africa and China and Africa, because that's one of the primary way in which we engage in international affairs. So one of the major aspects of many African countries and their relationship with Beijing, as you previously said, is the trade deficit and the amount of imports from China, which far exceeds from African exports to China. And given the BRI's express goal to improve the industrialization of Africa along with its manufacturing output, has the influx of Chinese products actually had the opposite effect of hurting the competitive ability of African firms? Or is there something more nuanced there? Or can Chinese development strategy in Africa actually improve Africa's manufacturing sector?
Well, I think that the true answer to the question is that both are true. And of course, it will vary from country to country. Keep in mind, we're talking about 54 different countries in Africa, and you're not going to have the same results in each one. It clearly is true that the importation of a wide range of Chinese goods have undercut the ability of African industries to produce a lot of those goods, because China can produce them cheaper, even with transport costs, and simply undercut whatever the Africans can turn out of a similar quality. And that's clearly had a negative impact in some countries. On the other hand, China, I think it's fair to say, has contributed the most to foreign direct investment in the manufacturing sector in Africa. It varies enormously from country to country. But in a country like Ethiopia, for example, it's made a major contribution. And when it invests directly in an African country in the manufacturing sector, it's doing so obviously to make a profit for the company. But this is a company located in an African country, and the African country gains benefits from it. And at some point in time, there will be some spillover effect into the local markets in these countries, where the local people will be able to adopt a lot of the learning that they have had and develop similar companies of their own. So there are those cases where it has been helpful, and there have been those cases where it has been unhelpful. Taken together, quite frankly, I'm not sure on balance how I would come out on that. It may be pretty much of a wash in terms of the benefits versus the downsides of it. I should also point out, in all fairness, that I emphasize the factor of Chinese trade surpluses with Africa. That's true, and it's been true for probably the last 15 years. But if you go back earlier than 15 years, trade across the continent in Africa was pretty much in balance with China's trade. But we're more interested, obviously, in the present and the future than we are the older past.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I guess the next thing that I want to unpack has to do with the debt aspect. Is given that's a huge aspect of the Belt and Road initiatives, and that characterize a lot of easy loans for Africa. And that obviously has its goods, but that also has its concerns. And to mitigate the debt repayment issues on the African side, the Chinese government has offered a number of debt payment cancellations and debt repayment extension in the light of relative economic downturn, most notably from the recent COVID-19 pandemic. And given this development, do you think this dispelled the fears of China's so-called debt trap diplomacy among African states? Because some of the Chinese investment in other parts of the region has been quite daunting for a lot of these African states. Like what happened to Sri Lanka deep sea port, which was now leased to China for 99 years back in 2017. So I'm just wondering, how will African react to the debt trap diplomacy that's been alleged as a concern?
Sure. The bad news is that China holds more African debt than any other individual country in the world. That's the bad news. The good news is that's only 20% of all of Africa's external debt. So there's often the presumption, and particularly in the West, that, oh my goodness, China must hold virtually all of Africa's debt. No, it's more than any other country, but it's on taking the whole continent, it's 20% of Africa's debt. Well, that's a lot, that's true. And it is of concern in certain countries. In fact, you take a country like Djibouti, it's probably about 80% of Djibouti's external debt. And it goes on down from there. In a lot of countries, it's almost non-existent. 1, 2, 3% of their external debt. So it's just totally unimportant. But it is a concern. And the whole debt trap issue, I think, in the case of Africa anyway, has been excessively sensationalized. There so far is not a single documented case where China has tried to extract resources or property or anything else based on slowness in paying back debt from an African country. Now that may happen in the future, who knows? But so far it hasn't happened. There have been several sensationalized press accounts that it might happen in places like Kenya, for example. It was once rumored to be the case as a result of Kenya's slowness in paying back the loan for the railway, that maybe China would take control of the Mombasa port in terms of calling in collateral. That just hasn't happened. And the same was true with an airport in Zambia. That hasn't happened. So one has to be pretty careful with the debt trap argument. Debt is an important issue. It's one that I think China is concerned about because they don't like to be criticized for holding excessive amounts of debt. And China has a policy where it is very fast to cancel debt on interest-free loans, which is a very small part of their loan portfolio. China has a policy that it will not cancel debt on concessionary loans. It expects the African countries to pay those back. Now it will reschedule debt. It will change the terms sometimes of the repayment schedule, but it has not so far canceled any debt of concessionary loans, only interest-free loans.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And yeah, so this very much ties into the broader picture associated with Chinese interests in Africa, given the interest manifested by those loan repayments. And so I would like to draw our attention to the diplomatic aspect of it. And so even though many consider China to be a great power in the present day, many people have noted China's distinct lack of strategic allies and partners beside countries like North Korea or Pakistan. And do you believe China's long-term investment strategies or loan lending strategies in Africa will pay dividends in the sense that it will provide China with powerful allies in the long run? Or will the alliance only be short-term associated with the ones of economic benefits? And yeah, what do you think?
It's an interesting question. China does not have a history of having, quote, allies or alliances like the United States has. I would argue that today, a considerable amount of U.S. global power is based on its alliances. In fact, that was one of the phrases in the quotation by Joseph Nye that I just concluded my remarks with. And that's a real strength of American foreign policy, are its alliances. And that's what we're seeing today in spades in the Ukraine. China doesn't have that kind of arrangement. It has arguably an alliance with North Korea. I'm not sure it has anything that could be considered an alliance. with anyone other than North Korea. There are some who argue, well, what about Russia? Well, maybe that's an alliance of sorts, but that's, to me, a little more of a marriage of convenience. I see a lot of potential problems in a China-Russia alliance. There's an awful lot they do not have in common, including policies in Africa. They do not look at Africa the same way at all. And now you've got this interesting arrangement with the Russians trying to get Chinese support for what's going on in the Ukraine. And they're struggling with that. China's between a rock and a hard spot on the Ukraine. I think it's a very uncomfortable situation for China. It does not fit China's policies of the past. And at the same time, they want to have a warm relationship with Russia. So if you look at the African countries, I see a whole different situation. I see very few countries that China would feel compelled to have any kind of a security relationship with. They just don't have the wherewithal to provide much to China to make a difference. Maybe South Africa does, maybe Egypt does, possibly Nigeria, maybe in a real stretch, Ethiopia, but that's a real stretch. Beyond that, I'm kind of hard pressed to come up with countries where China would say, gee, we've got to have an alliance with that country, because they're not going to get that much out of it. They want to have good relations with all of these countries in Africa, but alliances, I really don't see it. Maybe I'm missing something important here, but so far it just doesn't strike me as something that's on the agenda of China.
Thank you so much. And tying closely with the agenda of China, you said there was sort of a more pragmatic-based diplomacy in which China sort of interacts with everyone with perceived benefits. And so now into the political context, that many in the West believe that China is promoting an alternative model of governance in which economic prosperity and authoritarianism sort of triumphs over democracy and human rights. And people think it's concerning as we see this drift towards sort of an autocracy or authoritarianism in various parts of Africa, but particularly West Africa, based on some of the more recent Freedom House finding. And how much do you think China's emerging prominence is playing a role in sort of facilitating or contributing to this slide towards authoritarianism, state capitalism, and if we should be concerned about this trend in Africa?
Yeah, when I started doing research on China-Africa in about 2005, I looked at this issue pretty carefully. And at that time, I concluded that I didn't see much going on in terms of China trying to encourage its model be adopted in Africa. I've changed my views on that since Xi Jinping came to power. And I think today I would have to argue that there has been an effort to significantly step up the degree to which China is encouraging at least elements of its model, which it likes to say is focused on development, to be implemented in places like Africa, not just Africa, but other parts of the world as well. So I do see that as an issue today, and I see that in also the authoritarian component of it, because there are a lot of African countries that are by nature authoritarian. So they're quite willing to accept any kind of authoritarian model that comes out of China. It fits their beliefs very well. Even today in Tanzania, the president of Tanzania inaugurated the opening of the Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Leadership School, which is a school that is funded by China and the Communist Party of China. It's designed specifically to train the leaders of 6 ruling parties in Southern Africa, from Tanzania, South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. And you can almost bet that there are going to be, once it's fully underway, instructors from the Communist Party, from China generally, and they're going to be pushing the CPC mode of organization and ideology. And I think it's just a very vivid example of what China is aiming to do in Africa.
Yeah, thank you so much. And now drawing our attention back to the US, and in comparison to sort of Beijing's high-level attention and resources that we can see in the more recent decades, the United States' involvement in the region has been rather insignificant, as many believed. I think it's a former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. So he even said that China is kicking our tails everywhere in Africa. And as the Biden administration began to treat the rivalry with China more seriously, do you believe the US will close this engagement gap with China anytime soon? Or why not?
Yeah, I mean, first, I do take a little exception to the premise of the argument, and that's why I spelled out in my opening remarks the comparison of what China and the US are doing in Africa. There are some areas where China is kicking the US tail in Africa, there's no doubt about it. But if American aid is well over 3 times Chinese aid to Africa, if foreign direct investment stock is about equal, if American bilateral security arrangements are more important than Chinese bilateral security arrangements, yeah, that's not exactly kicking tail. It is true that China has significantly upped its game in Africa, and the United States has relaxed, and there's no doubt about that. And we paid a price for it, and I think that the Biden administration realizes that. It's trying to turn that around, but it's going to require more than just the Biden administration. It's going to require the US Congress. It's going to require the American public to take a greater interest in Africa. That's really what it's all about. How interested is the United States in Africa? And the answer, quite frankly, has been not much. It has always been the lowest foreign policy priority of the United States. That has not been the case for China. I think arguably Latin America, at least until recently, had a lower priority for China than Africa did. And China has just given certainly more attention to Africa during this century than the United States has. So the Biden administration is trying to up its game. And there are some signs of that, particularly in the Horn of Africa, where it has been much more engaged in trying to mediate disputes in Ethiopia and Sudan. It remains to be seen if it's going to up its game across the continent. And it remains to be seen if Congress is going to join in and provide some of the additional resources that are needed. So there's a long way to go for the United States. And if in the final analysis, the US public just doesn't give a damn, it isn't going to happen. It's really just that simple. And so far, I haven't seen an enormous outpouring of interest by the American public.
Yeah, thank you. And so now I want to draw our attention to the cooperation aspect of the US-Africa relation and China-Africa relation, or more broadly, US-China cooperation in Africa. So you mentioned a lot of the ways in which US and China can cooperate. And I feel like a lot of international agencies sort of agree with that. And especially the WHO, they say that the pandemic response is one of the fields in which the US and China can and must cooperate. And this specifically ties into the distribution, transportation, and the rollout of vaccines in Africa. And others says that the development of renewable energy has huge potential for the US-China cooperation, given the USAID has already been involved in the continent's solar energy production by a substantial amount, while China has also immense role in the construction of hydroelectric facilities and dams, with the example of the Great Renaissance Dam. And so, if possible, what are the keys to US-China cooperation in the region? And what specific fields of cooperation do you consider as probable in the future?
Yeah, and when you say future, goodness knows I can't predict when, if ever, that this relationship will turn around again. Could get worse for that matter. But I'm a diplomat or was a diplomat, and I like to try to look at the positive and hope always springs eternal. If you look particularly at the power sector, there actually was at one time some cooperation between General Electric providing turbines for dams that China was building. And there was collaboration between General Electric and whatever the Chinese companies were that were building the dams. That could return at some point. I don't see it happening anytime in the foreseeable future, but that is very much of a possibility. China, as you probably all know, has been very engaged in building solar panels. They're probably the world's leader in solar panels and pretty much put the Americans out of business with our own solar panel business. They are doing some of that now in Africa, particularly in South Africa, where they've been engaged in working with South Africans build solar panels. I'm not sure at this point whether there's any way for U.S. companies to get involved in that or not. I'm not sure that I see that at the moment, but I don't rule it out. I think with the emphasis of the Biden administration on renewable energy and a continuation of President Obama's Power Africa initiative, which is being continued under Biden, there may be some possibilities here in the renewable energy sector for some kind of collaboration. So it is a possibility. And you mentioned vaccines and medicine. That too is a potential area for collaboration. I don't see it at the moment. I think it's true that the United States has actually pledged more vaccine to Africa than China has pledged. I think China has provided more so far. And the US has been slow in delivering. But a lot of the early Chinese deliveries were sales. They weren't giving it away, they were selling it. Well, that's fine, but I'm not sure that's quite the same thing as a donation. In any event, both China and the United States want to end all diseases in Africa or slow them down. And there was collaboration in the past on things like Ebola. There could be collaboration on dealing with COVID-19. But it may be that other solutions will be found to COVID-19 before the China-US relationship gets back to the point where we can do anything on this.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it is about time for me to allow the audience to ask questions. So is there any questions from the audience at the moment?
Yeah, perfect timing. Thank you very much for that. So we are going to be moving on to the last section of tonight's event, which is usually the most exciting and why people want to come, which is the Q&A. So we do have a runner with a microphone over here, Nick. So if you're here in person, please raise your hand and Nick will come over and allow you to ask your question. And then also for people online, please send your private message to me, which is Dylan Shepard, and I will try to get to as many questions as possible. Does anyone want to start off with a question? Yes.
I'm in no rush to leave, so if you want to go a little beyond, or you want to go beyond 7 o'clock, that's fine by me.
Great. Well, thank you, Ambassador, for being here, and thank you to both of y'all for running a wonderful event tonight. Andrew Harding with the Elliott School and with the U.S. China Strategic Studies Organization. I think everyone in the room knows and everyone watching is well aware of the BRI, the threats it poses to U.S. national security, and the overall benefits it could provide Chinese grand strategy. What most people may not know about is the Build Back Better World initiative, the B3W. And I don't think the signatories know a lot about it either. With that being the case, I think having a strong U.S. grand strategy is necessary to combat the impacts of the BRI. But it feels as though the B3W just doesn't have the weight behind it to really combat the BRI. Based off your assessment, your knowledge with U.S.-Africa, China-Africa relations, and these potential plans involved, what could the B3W ultimately develop into? And what needs to be done to put it into a position to successfully challenge the impacts of the BRI, specifically in Africa?
Yeah, I take maybe a contrarian view on the whole argument that's going on between BRI and B3W. When it was first announced and I read the B3W document, and then I saw all the commentators saying, well, this was an initiative to compete with the BRI. I said, where are they coming from? We're talking about two rather different things here. And I frankly don't see them competing that much because they are very different animals. But let me back up even further than that on BRI, and I'll come back to B3W. I see BRI as largely an initiative focused on Central Asia, South Asia, and Europe. Africa's sort of a last-minute add-on. It really doesn't have that much impact in Africa. And if you look at what China is calling BRI projects in Africa today, it's what was going on, a lot of it is what was going on in Africa before Xi Jinping even announced BRI in, I think, 2013. Either the projects were underway or they had been announced. And all of a sudden they got thrown into BRI. Overnight, voila, they are BRI projects. Well, okay, that's fine. You know, we all can play these games. But to me, that's BRI in Africa. Now, have they added new projects? Yes, they have. And I think that in terms of the maritime Silk Road, there is some real meaning in Africa to BRI, particularly from the security point of view, going through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, the northern rim of the northern rim of Africa along the Mediterranean, I think does have some security interests that fall in the grand plan of the BRI. But beyond that, I'm a little hard pressed to understand what's the big deal about the BRI in Africa. The fact that almost every country in Africa has signed a memorandum of understanding with China on the BRI is meaningless. Anybody can sign a document. I can sign the damn thing. It doesn't mean anything's going to happen, but they all have, or almost all the countries have signed these things. And until there's some real meaningful activity there, I don't really get all excited about it. Now, let me go back to B3W and why I think on the American side, we're getting it wrong by trying to suggest that this is the response to BRI. I don't think it is the response. If you look at B3W, it's doing very different kinds of infrastructure than BRI is doing. BRI, for the most part, is doing the hard infrastructure of roads, railroads, dams, bridges, all this good stuff. The B3W is more focused on soft infrastructure, capacity building, improving systems, gender equality, and all of this stuff that I don't even see in the BRI. So for me, I think B3W is a great initiative. I'm all for it. But also is very much focused on cooperation of the private sector. And if you don't have the private sector involved, you don't have much with B3W. And so far, I'm not sure I've seen that much coming from the private sector. So there are, in my view, some real disconnects between BRI and B3W. I wish that the American audience would just ignore the BRI when they talk about B3W and do everything possible to make B3W work and demonstrate that it can be useful to Africa and elsewhere if possible. But don't make these what I consider to be invidious comparisons with BRI, because I think it's a totally different animal. Thanks.
In the back.
Thank you, Dr. Shinn. My name is also Andrew. I'm a grad student here at the Elliott School. My question is more on the democratic space and the governance issue. I also work at the National Endowment for Democracy, the side note. One of the big issues that we're seeing is providing aid to these countries, because you mentioned how much aid we do give an unbelievable amount of aid, but those countries have no mechanisms to enforce any kind of good governance or any kind of anti-corruption, anti-kleptocratic system. I think of Nigeria and Buhari, not that Buhari and Xi Jinping are best friends, but we do provide a lot of aid to Nigeria. So how do we ensure that the aid actually does what it's supposed to do, and that those actors such as Buhari, which is not the best example, but such as him, don't flee and go to China and have their influence come to the West?
You know, you raise a good conundrum, and the United States has never figured out fully how to grapple with it, nor, quite frankly, has any other country. The United States does provide an enormous amount of aid. It provides more bilateral aid than any other single country. The European Union collectively provides a lot more aid to Africa. Most of the American aid is humanitarian assistance. And it is, I think, arguably a little bit easier to control what happens to humanitarian aid. It's not very fungible. You pretty much, if it's food aid, for example, or medicine, you pretty much have to get it to people who are in need of it. There are some ways to corrupt it, but by and large, I think you can maintain relatively good control over humanitarian assistance. But there's a lot of other aid, and particularly when it comes to the democracy area, the security area, it becomes harder and harder to control how ultimately the aid is used. And that applies not just to American aid, but to aid from any other country. I'm not sure I have a good answer to your question. And I know that you said you're with NED, is that right? You know, NED has grappled with this for probably as long as anyone has. And I'm sure they have a ton of recommendations for trying to improve systems to minimize corruption, minimize misuse of aid, and to get it to do what it's supposed to do, which is encourage democratization. But democracy is not easy. As we have found out in the United States of America, that we have a real problem sometimes making democracy work. And if we haven't figured it out after well over 200 years, it's, you know, I've got to cut a little slack for the African countries that haven't figured it out either, and they haven't, and we're all kind of still struggling with it. Not a very satisfactory answer to your question, but it's an honest one.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shinn. Elliott Raymond from the Onero Institute. And as you mentioned a little bit earlier, a big part of the Chinese and African states relations is energy. You mentioned a little bit about energy, renewable energy and such. But of course, a lot of the energy, being built in Africa has to do with coal fire and things that maybe aren't renewable resources. So what are the prospects for renewable energy on the continent, given the context of American relations in Africa and especially Chinese relations in Africa when it comes to investment?
Yeah, your question is very timely in that this is one area where China has actually done some useful things in basically the last year. They are trying to cut back, and they have cut back their support for coal-fired plants in Africa, and I think maybe some other parts of the world too. They were among the worst offenders when it comes to building coal-fired plants. But I think because of their own problems in China and the pollution issues, by using large quantities of coal, and there still is a huge amount of coal used in China for generating energy, but they're realizing they're paying a huge price for it. And I think they have found that they don't want to export those problems overseas if they can possibly avoid it. So they are taking steps to cut back, and that's a good thing. I wish they would move faster on that and basically just eliminate any coal-fired power support in Africa and move entirely into renewables. To the best of my knowledge, they haven't done that yet, but at least they're moving in the right direction on it. And I think even the Africans who have not been particularly good about focusing on renewable energy, in part because it does tend to be expensive, and the Africans are always looking for ways to cut costs. They've been slow on the uptick. The Africans in most parts of the continent should be making enormously more use of solar. Now, solar is not that easy and it's sometimes hard to maintain. I mean, I can remember traveling around the deserts of Burkina Faso in the 1980s and seeing some abandoned solar panels that no one was there to keep them up, and they just went into disuse, which was a real pity because Burkina Faso is one of those countries where solar energy should be a major supplier of power. I think as time goes on, the African countries will understand that this is the future, but they are slow to get there. And outside countries like the United States and China need to encourage them to head in that direction.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions from the audience. Otherwise, I will check Zoom. Or yeah, gentleman in the front.
Hello, my name is Julian Anderson. I'm with USCSSO. My question is, back in 2013, 2015, there was some publications about the potential for US and China health diplomacy and cooperation in Africa, specifically over malaria, given the United States has the kind of the innovation capability with pharmaceuticals and China has kind of a horizontal approach in the manufacturing. So it seems like they were compatible. Is there still an opportunity for that kind of health diplomacy cooperation in Africa to defeat malaria?
Yeah, in fact, I was making the argument back in 2007 that malaria was the one area where the US and China really ought to think about collaborating in Africa in order to reduce the problem of malaria, which is a huge, huge problem throughout much of the continent. And it never got any traction. And I never fully understood why it didn't get any traction. Eventually, there was a little traction with Ebola, as I mentioned earlier, but with malaria, it never happened. And the United States was at that time providing things like bed nets and expertise for reducing the quantity of mosquitoes and whatnot in certain locations in Africa. The Chinese were producing, I've forgotten the name of the medicine that was used, made out of wormwood. It's got a special name that escapes me at the moment. And I think to some extent that medicine has lost some of its impact because of the immunity issue has hampered its ability to do what it used to do. But in any event, at one point in time, it was the leading medicine for dealing with malaria in Africa. And to me, it seemed to me like, if the United States could go in and provide some of the personnel, the bed nets, some of that expertise, and the Chinese could provide this medicine, which they were doing, and it could be done collaboratively. It was just an idea made in heaven. Didn't happen. I don't know why. And of course, now, because of the relationship, the China-US relationship, I don't see much likelihood of that going forward. There just isn't the initiative in either Beijing or Washington to do anything on malaria. But it is absolutely a field in the future that could come into that cooperative category.
I would like to get to one question from online. And I'm going to paraphrase this since it's a little bit lengthy. But an anonymous user wants to ask the question. So on a number of these larger infrastructure projects between China and a number of African nations, there have been allegations of racism towards workers involved in the program. And wanted to ask, how has this affected sort of Africa's view on its relationship with China? Has it had any bearing on the Sino-African relationship?
Racism is a universal phenomenon. It's not as though the Africans have never seen racism before. They've seen plenty of it, and I could even argue that there are some Africans who have racist views of others. And I think I could make a pretty strong argument to that effect. So the fact that there have been incidents, and there clearly have been, involving Chinese shouldn't surprise anyone. There have been incidents involving nationalities from around the world in Africa or Africans in China for that matter. In fact, the bigger problem has actually been Africans in China, where you've had a much more exposure by Africans to Chinese, some of whom are not particularly well educated, the taxi drivers or the people who are running small shops, that kind of thing, where you're likely to have a greater likelihood, I think, of a racist reaction. And that has happened with some of the Chinese laborers in working in Africa. These are contract personnel, not well educated. They only speak Mandarin. They don't have any real way of communicating with the Africans. Some of it is just a misunderstanding of communication, but some of it is outright racism. And I have no doubt that it has taken a certain toll on Africans when it does happen. But as I say, the Africans have experienced this for decades from a variety of nationalities. So I suspect that they don't see the Chinese much differently than they do anybody else when it comes to racism.
Okay, I think that will conclude our event. Could we please get one more round of applause for our two speakers?
Thank you all for coming and good luck with your studies this semester.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
And before we close, just a few formalities I wanted to announce regarding some upcoming events and other things that you may be interested in. First, I wanted to thank some of the important people that have made this project possible. I'm talking about Tappy Lung and Elad Raymond, the two leaders of the organizations, the U.S. Strategic Studies Organization and the Onero Institute that ran this event, as well as Alice Lee, who helped on outreach. Also wanted to thank the editing team at Onero. So on top of the event tonight, we have also provided, and I think I can show this here. Taichung and I have been writing a number of essays to complement this event tonight around some of the major issues of discussion. So if you're more interested about competition over investment or collaboration over distributing vaccines in Africa, those topics and more will be provided in QR codes now. Other things I wanted to mention before we close is that this is just, again, the first event of actually 3 collaborations between the U.S. China Strategic Studies Organization and the Onero Institute, all centered around this theme of U.S. China Youth Exposition. There's going to be one on Wednesday, March 23rd. That's going to be about U.S. China climate policy, as well as one on Wednesday, April 6th, about U.S. China competition in space, which I think, given your interest in this topic, you may find interesting as well. Finally, the USCSSO conference is going to be Wednesday, March 2nd, and that's going to feature a panel of renowned experts on U.S.-China relations. And on the Onero Institute side of things, they will be hosting an event later this week, actually next week, early next week, which is the Somaliland Inside and Out event, which will be on Zoom. So if you're interested in either of those events, please make sure to check out our websites and social media in order to sign up. With all that said, I really want to thank you for coming because I know it is midterm season, so people tend to be pretty busy. Glad to have events back in person again after all this time. So one more final round of applause. Tsung-Han, former Ambassador David Shinn. Thank you.
Professor.